Om Shanti. Today the subject of emotional maturity is in front of us. And in fact, in the path of spiritual practice, personal development, Raj Yoga, the process of becoming an angel, bodiless, egoless, viceless, can also be called emotional maturity. And it's quite helpful for our churning to look at these very deep subjects and articulate them in a variety of different words, because words bring forward many associations within us, and it helps us to understand our subject more broadly and also to bring it onto a very practical platform. Daddy Janki has also been speaking about emotional maturity, so you have quite a few points on that already. And one of the aspects that she brought up, which I thought was very profound, is that criticism is emotional maturity. And then Baba had also said this expression, "I am right," is a sign of arrogance. And it doesn't happen usually that in a very obviously arrogant way we say, "I am right, this one is wrong," and we criticize knowing that we're criticizing. That would be too obvious. And we've got past that stage. At the same time, when you respond to something with the thought that something is obvious, you say, "It's obvious, isn't it?" That's another way of saying, "I'm right." Because to you, it's obvious. But from where are you coming? It's from a very self-centered perspective. And self-centeredness is the same thing as emotional immaturity. Immaturity means you haven't grown up yet, you haven't understood something yet. And maturity means you have understood and you have grown up. Maturity has very much to do with self-respect. And self-respect means to be assertive. To be immature is to be aggressive. To be mature is to be assertive. And there is a very subtle difference between being aggressive and being assertive. And a certain attitude in one person's vocabulary would be articulated a different way in another person's vocabulary because they're coming from a different mentality. So in a sense, we have made these things subjective because we haven't appreciated the subtleties. But I think if we do appreciate the subtleties, then it's easier for us to be more objective, and then it isn't just, well, that's how I see it, and it isn't just all relative. It doesn't mean to say that we want to be absolutist about things, because that also becomes dogmatic, and then if something is dogmatic, then you have a reaction against that. But what we're interested in is clarity. One of the difficulties of emotional immaturity is that there's a lot of self-deception within that. Because when there's emotional immaturity, then maturity is replaced by arrogance, which goes by the name of maturity, but it isn't actually maturity. And so how do we know if something is a particular thing? Is by its qualities. For example, today's Murli, God was talking about himself and saying, I am like this, like this, like this. And Dari Janki brought up this point that who is he, what is he, where is he, what does he do, what does he not do? The signs of God. In the same way, when we talk about the question of the omnipresence of God, it is said in the picture that we use to illustrate this point that the omnipresence of God is a feeling, but not a fact. In the same way, maturity is sometimes a feeling, but not a fact. And we need to be able to distinguish between when something is a feeling and a fact, and when something is a feeling and not a fact. And in a way, emotional immaturity is when something is a feeling but not a fact, and emotional maturity is when something is both a feeling and a fact. So for something to be a fact, the signs of it must be there, and the consequences must be predictable. So if we say, I am right, and begin to impose that particular opinion as being an obvious fact, as compared with an opinion which comes from your own perspective of, say, emotional immaturity, and you make statements, comments, criticisms, if it were a fact, the consequences would be positive. If the consequences are not positive, then you can know that it wasn't a fact, but it was a deception. I see. These are very subtle things, so I hope you're following me. Yes? Or am I being confusing for you? One of the things that was also coming up, which we can speak of by way of example, is the expression culture. If we use the term culture from a perspective of emotional immaturity, and we contrast that by using the word culture from a perspective of emotional maturity, we can see some interesting distinctions. They're very subtle distinctions, and because they're very subtle, people don't see them so easily. And part of what we want to do is to make something invisible into something visible, because then when you see it, then there isn't any question. If you can't see it, then it becomes an impression, and that's where feelings that are not facts get taken to be feelings that are facts. I see. We have the expression Brahman culture, which Baba had introduced a few years ago. And part of that expression that Baba had introduced, from my own perspective, is that it seems to me Baba is creating a new civilization, which also means a culture, where to be virtuous, to be human, to be real, to be clean, clear, and honest is the same thing as the culture. And the way each and every one of us experiences day-to-day life is very much influenced by the way those around us see it. When a person is in a particular environment, a particular society, anywhere in the Iron Age, it doesn't matter where it is, there are always some attitudes, behaviors, and commonly accepted ways of doing things that actually are body conscious, but everyone agrees that we're going to consider those things good things. And they become invisible because of this, what we call as a tacit agreement. You don't actually openly make the agreement, but you just agree, you just go along with it. So it's called a tacit agreement, an unspoken agreement. See? And when you go into a different culture, the people in that other culture don't have that tacit agreement, and so therefore it becomes visible. And there may be some things in that culture that are tacit agreements that are not visible to them, but they're visible to you because you don't have that tacit agreement. But anytime something like that is a tacit agreement, regardless of what culture it is, I think, a form of body consciousness. And then there are other things which are forms of self-respect, self-regard, and assertiveness. For example, there are people who have clarity and who have self-respect. And when they're communicating with someone who doesn't have self-respect, those people with that clarity will not buy into the games that are part of that lack of self-respect. And then the person who has the lack of self-respect doesn't like that. And this will make their ego problem more acute. And it will provoke them to think, I am right, obviously, and start making a criticism about that person who has self-respect, whereas the person with self-respect will simply act in a way that is true to themselves, and they won't bother to make any comment about the one who doesn't have self-respect. But the one who doesn't have self-respect will hurt inside because their ego got pushed to the surface to the point that they are uncomfortable inside. But they will not think that it's ego, they will think that the other person has ego. This is why it's difficult, because it feels like something, but it doesn't mean it is that thing. It's a very subtle thing. But it's a part of emotional maturity. A person with emotional maturity is strong. And that strength is consolidated and it is acquired through experience and through having faced themselves. There may be something that hurts your ego. Take, for example, if you make a request for something, and from your perspective it's a reasonable request, and the person is able to give it to you, but they refuse you. They have the power to refuse you, and you can't do anything about it. You will not feel good. But at the same time, you will not suffer, but you will suffer. You will not suffer because something negative has happened to you. You will suffer because your ego has been hurt by a refusal, by a rejection. I see. And this capacity of a rejection to produce internal suffering is a sign that you still have emotional immaturity. I see. Because one of the things that we find in this spiritual practice is that you get things that are very opposite of one another happening together. In the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, it talks about, it gives a lot of importance to the stable stage of being free from the effect of the pairs of opposites like praise and defamation, success and failure. And this aspect of spirituality comes quite frequently in Gyan also, because this really is the knowledge of the Gita. And we find in our regular experience that we may be given one moment a very, very high position, and then the next moment some big insult will happen. And then the test is, do you go up with the praise and down with the insult? Because if you do, then that's emotional immaturity. And so that's not spirituality. When you go up with the praise, you will not feel that you're making any mistake, because it's obvious that why not enjoy it? But when you go down with the insult, then you don't feel comfortable, because technically you think that I should be able to handle this, but practically you're burning up inside and you can't do anything about it, and maybe it'll come on your face and anybody might see, and that would be classified as failure, you see. And there's quite traditional Gyan to teach that do not go up with the praise, because if you do, you will definitely have to bite the dust with the insult, and you will not be able to do anything about it, purely and simply because you went up with the praise, and things have to balance. And you do not have the power to change those laws. And they are laws that are as definite as the laws of physics. You know, you can't just suddenly have the apples not falling down, but instead falling up and say, forget about gravity, we don't need it. You can't do anything about it, it just is. In the same way, these laws of spirituality, they just are. But the human being in the Iron Age has become so dominated by false ego, which is another way of saying emotional immaturity, that the soul is blind. And so when we develop spirituality, when we receive the knowledge, we get this great clarity, which is called the third eye. But then, as Daddy Janki was saying this morning, Baba will bring you in, but it's up to you to stay in. And all of the tests will be tests of ego, but also tests of emotional immaturity. And when you hear the expression emotional immaturity, the first response of the ego is to say, well, that doesn't apply to me. I'm not immature, I'm not childish, you see. But the question is, have you ever made any comments about anybody? Have you? Probably. You know. And that is the sign that there is lack of love, that there is self-centeredness, that there is selfishness, that all of these vices which we feel that we don't have are actually present. Just because they're present in a subtle form doesn't mean that they're not present. You see? Because the gross form is anyway too obvious, so we're not dealing with the gross form. But whether the thing is in a gross form or a subtle form, it doesn't mean that it's not that thing. It's still that thing. It's still body consciousness. It's still ego. It's still immaturity. So emotional maturity has to do with being very stable. And you can't be very stable if you're not strong. And you can't be strong until and unless you have really faced yourself. And when you have faced yourself, then it means that you can pinpoint what you're doing when you're doing something that's off track. And so, for example, if we say, well, that's not my culture, what are we actually saying? Maybe part of what we're saying is, I have got used to certain particular tacit agreements, and rather than question those tacit agreements, it's easier for me to say that something that doesn't correspond with what I'm used to must, by definition, be wrong because it doesn't feel right. You see, but that's not very advanced to approach it that way. You know, rather, it is better for us, if we find ourselves in a situation like that, to wait for a minute before we give the instant, hasty reaction, which we think is a considered response, but actually it's quite a quick reaction. You know, kind of shoot first and ask questions later. But it's not very mature to do that. So part of the sign of maturity is, you know, stop, look and listen. Think for a minute. Okay, this is something I'm used to, this particular way of being, and here I am face to face with a challenge. What am I going to do with this thing? And the first thing we have to do is to question our own assumptions and our preconceptions about the fact that if something feels right, it must be right, and if it feels wrong, it must be wrong. Because you see, that would be a sense perception. And we know from our spiritual studies, or even any other studies, that appearances are not usually reality. And we're often told not to judge a book by its cover, but because everybody does, you know, the commercial interests will use people's vices to sell their products, because people do not question themselves first, they question what's different first, you see. And that is actually emotional immaturity. Maturity is, okay, here's a challenge. The first thing I have to do is question my assumptions. Because all of the assumptions that we have, where do they come from? They come from our upbringing, and our environment, which is from the Iron Age. We cannot say that we got born in the Confluence Age. There are a few who are very fortunate, and they come into, or they take birth into a family that very quickly comes in Gyan, and then they are surrounded by the spiritual knowledge, depending on the degree of involvement of their family members. But most of us come into Gyan in our adult life, and so all of that formation has already taken place during our early years, which is where we develop all of these preconceptions and ideas about what's what. And even though when we come into Gyan, we have to question everything and redefine our understanding of what a soul is and what God is and what karma is and all of those things. At that level, it's so different from the existing ideas, philosophical, religious ideas, that it's clear what the difference is. But then when it comes to social relationships and protocols and procedures and interactions and so on, it's less obvious. And so there are more opportunities to think, I am right. And for our ego to operate without any limit in that arena. Because there's no way that we would suddenly say, well, I don't think I'm a soul, I'm a body. We know too clearly that that's not the case. But how far we are limited by presumptions that have to do with social interaction, which are not articulated very much, but which come up as ways in which we display our emotional immaturity, and at the same time we are convinced that we are right. We don't even say, I'm right, we say, it's obvious. Or else we use the expression, them. They do this. To have us and them is actually what Daddy had talked about earlier, Daddy Janki, this differences of opinion. See? Having differences of opinion, you do your thing, I'll do mine, is actually immature, because we haven't thought about the long-term consequences of that kind of attitude. What we're trying to reach is an ability to operate with a large number of people, all of whom have their own sanskaras, and their own karmic accounts, and so on. And we want to be able to operate wisely. So the first thing is that divisiveness isn't wise. And the reason it's not wise is because you lose. And when Baba said to us today, aim to get a high status, that doesn't include making choices from a position of short-sighted ego in which ultimately you lose. That's not the sign of a sovereign. So it means that we have to see in our thoughts about ourselves, in our self-inventory, a rigorous self-inventory we have to do, and see what really are the long-term consequences of the attitudes that I hold? And the only way in which we will know to check up a particular attitude is when it gets challenged. Because if it doesn't get challenged, we won't notice that it exists. Just as every day the sun rises, but we don't rush out in the morning and say, hey, the sun has risen. But if it didn't, we would notice. So things which are routine, things which happen all the time, and where we don't get any challenge, we don't have any reason to think there's anything wrong with it. So one of the great benefits of Baba bringing people together of different cultures is that it is a perfect circumstance in which to experience challenges that couldn't occur where you are with people who all have the same tacit agreements. So this is one of the very, very interesting things that Baba is doing. The ancient original dharma of deities, Adi Sanatan Devi Devta Dharma, is also part of our identity. And even Baba has said those who are double foreigners have to consider the fact that it is not possible to recognize Gyan until and unless you had passed through 84 births. And passed through the Golden Age, Silver Age, Copper Age, Iron Age, and passed through the Confluence Age the last time it was here. And those activities, those histories of the Golden Age, Silver Age, Copper Age, they take place here in India. And to take birth in a foreign country for a Brahman soul, deity soul, Golden Age soul, Silver Age soul, soul who has passed through 84 births, the karmic account that can put a person into a different color, culture, region, language group, has to be relatively slight. And the overwhelming majority of deity souls remained in this land, but a significant minority went outside and comes back with these acquired differences that are based in tacit agreements that come from regional ways in which false ego is developed. Regional ways. So this regional way clashes against that regional way. And that clash is superficiality. If we will go deep, we will just see regional differences are regional differences, so what, doesn't matter. It's really not an us and them thing. So part of our spiritual practice is to make use of circumstances that appear to be uncomfortable or challenging, so that they actually propel us into a deeper place in ourselves. Because the false ego is an acquired thing. It's a recent thing. And it doesn't correspond with our conscience, but it does correspond with our habits or our environmental, what we're used to, you see. So this is why these things are very, very good to get us to really question our assumptions, presumptions, preconceptions. We get into certain ways of doing things because that's what everybody does. But when it isn't that same everybody as a different everybody, then you notice those things. So it's very, very useful. One of the things that we can do in the environment of this spiritual practice is develop solitude. Solitude and introversion. Not easy, because loneliness and escapism masquerade as solitude and introversion. They're not the same thing. Loneliness is an unhappy condition. In solitude, you're so deep inside that you don't notice that you're alone. In solitude, you can be included or excluded or there or not there. Those variations don't have an impact on you. In loneliness, if you're pampered, you feel good. If the attention goes somewhere else, you feel bad. That's emotional immaturity. In solitude, a person makes themselves emotionally self-sufficient, because you are not feeling good on the basis of somebody validating who you are. You already know who you are. If somebody recognizes you, doesn't recognize you, it doesn't make any difference to you. But if a person says, you don't know me, you don't realize who I am, you don't recognize me, that means that person is very needy. That means spiritually depleted. So spiritually depleted and emotionally immature go together. When a person is emotionally mature, that maturation comes through a lot of facing the self, facing outside things, enduring things, getting a lot of experience of life. Emotionally mature person is also what they call as street smart. You don't have illusions about things. You don't make yourself into a china doll that everybody has to worry about, might break this, might break that, you know. That's very immature, the little doll stage. That's based on a lot of illusions. So an emotionally immature person has a lot of fairy tale ideas and a lot of illusions, which of course life will break. That is the duty of life, to break the illusions. So if you experience, like that loneliness goes along with disillusionment, oh, I thought it would be like this, but it isn't, and then you get disillusioned that it's difficult, it's, you know, how am I going to manage? This kind of waste thought comes, and you feel that this reality check is a bad thing because it doesn't feel good. This feeling of disillusionment is considered as a negative experience. But ask yourself intelligently, do I want to be with illusions or without illusions? Especially that we know one of the translations of Maya is illusion. Yeah? Illusion. Illusion means it's not real, it's not there. Maya, that which is not there. So do I want to live on the basis of a perception that's based in illusion, or do I want to be free from that? Because part of what Baba gives to us is freedom from Maya, or freedom from illusions. That means we have to have all our illusions broken, destroyed, taken out, because they're not real. And what we have requested in our petitions to God over many births is, oh God, let me know the truth. Maybe we forgot to say, or maybe we didn't say, we don't want to see the real truth, we just want to see the pretty truth. Illusions are very pretty. Sometimes it is said the truth is awful truth, or naked truth, or these kinds of expressions, so that truth hurts, but sometimes is good pain, because it takes out the illusions, and it takes out the childishness. And what we want to be is without any of that stuff, so that we can get on with the real work, you see. And so it's an important thing to allow and to fill oneself up with such a power of tolerance. Tolerance is necessary to be able to manage disillusionment, because if we don't have tolerance and we get disillusioned, we can't handle it, there's no use. You just break in pieces, so that's not useful. So you have to have tolerance so that you can be disillusioned, so that you can be clear. It's better. So we have to be able to manage things that hurt the ego. Because if you get disillusioned about something, it doesn't actually damage you, but it might not be comfortable. If you do get deluded, it will definitely damage you, and it will be comfortable for a while, and then it'll be very uncomfortable. And so, like this emotional maturity has to do with looking at things not from a feeling point of view. One of the things you probably know, Sister Morney, who was in Hong Kong, now in Australia, she said a very good thing. Love is not a noun, it's a verb. It's something that you do. It's not something that you feel. It's an act. Yeah, that is love, you see. Otherwise, when we have emotional immaturity, we have a tendency to think that all of these warm, fuzzy feelings are the qualities, because we think a quality is a feeling. You know? But we need to go deeper into that and understand that these qualities are byproducts of acts that are real, acts that are true. You see? Because, if somebody wants something from you, they'll what's said is they'll love you, they'll be nice to you, they'll pamper you, they'll get you to give you what they want, which may be what you don't want to do, but you get deluded by this feeling which goes by the name of love, but which is in reality deception. You see, and we all fall for it because we like to be, loved. But then the divine intellect, the third eye of the one who has emotional maturity, will not be deceived by those things. We get deceived by those things because we want something. You see, and love means, give you this, give you little this thing, give you little that thing, a present, some status, some this, some that. This is all bribery. You see, it's not love. And then you fall. So people use the expression falling in love. What it really means is falling in vices. If you love someone, it doesn't have anything to do with falling in love. It has to do with understanding who they are, appreciating them, and allowing them to be exactly who they are without interfering in them. That's more loving, you see. And that is a non-dependent kind of thing. Whenever there is emotional immaturity, you're always trying to get something from some local source, not from the supreme source. This is why solitude is very good, because in solitude you are with yourself, and once you are with yourself, the only one is Baba. Anything else doesn't make any sense. So your conscience will tell you, speak to you properly in that solitude, in that introversion. But you have to be able to handle being alone with yourself. And when you're very, very clean inside and you've faced yourself, then you find that you're the most interesting person there is anyway. And you're very, very happy to be you. You don't want to be anybody else. You don't know how to be anybody else. You know how to be you. But that kind of soul consciousness comes through the rigorous self-inventory, the introversion, the serious meditation. And why Baba gives us the knowledge of drama is to be able to see all of those things as simply a game. A game of, victory and defeat, happiness and unhappiness, all of this stuff, but not to think that it's real. Because that would be emotional immaturity. Emotional maturity or wisdom is also very much connected with that which is called the witness consciousness. You just are who you are, and you are with God, and you observe everything, and it is what it is. It's not good, it's not bad, it just is. And you don't have to do anything about it, and you can't do anything about it. And if you try and do something about it, you will definitely pay a heavy price. You see? But emotional maturity means I know who I am and I just have to be true to myself. And then your stage will do the service. Because when people see, as you have heard in classes, when people see that you are completely honest with yourself and true to yourself, then they understand something. Because otherwise people are confusing. Something inside, something outside. They say something, they do something else. It's very problematical, when you're all the time involved in what everybody else is doing. Then you lose contact with the self. And the self gets taken over by all these tacit agreements that people have about what's cool and what's good and what's not good. But in introversion and solitude, you think, what is really real? Why am I in this in the first place? And you get your priorities right. And gradually you become wise. And that keeps you very near to Baba, very real, and very much a person who doesn't waste time. Because your conscience also is in very good working order. So it lets you know, this is a waste of time, this is not real, this is unnecessary, and you stick with what's really real. And so they say, just Atma Chintan, you're thinking about the reality of yourself. Which is why I say, ultimately, you find out that you are the most interesting person you know. So then you aren't needy. So you become emotionally self-sufficient, and you are taking power from Baba. You're not needing to be something or do something or go somewhere or anything, but you just prefer that whatever Baba wishes to do through you, let there be no barrier to that by your emotional immaturity. It creates a lot of barriers. So Baba definitely will use a good instrument. So a good instrument means you are bodiless, egoless, viceless. It's a good instrument. And the false you isn't always in front, and the real you harmonizes with Baba very well. And then when it comes to other people, you aren't going to be divisive. This one's like this one's good, this one's bad. It's as if from deep within yourself, you know the knowledge of drama in which you say each soul has their part. Let them play it. From the depth of yourself, give everyone your good wishes to be exactly who they are, and that they should catch hold of Baba. Because as much as you yourself have caught hold of yourself and caught hold of Baba, that much you are, stable, solid, real, fearless. What do you have to be afraid of? If you criticize, you have something to be afraid of. Because it comes from ego, because it comes from emotional immaturity, because as Daddy Janki said last night, you don't even realize you're doing something wrong. Because it's obvious it must be right. You see? So whenever you feel or you say to yourself, oh, that's obvious, red flag, that's not obvious. That comes from a very limited perspective. It's not at all obvious. It may not be what you think at all. Sit, wait, watch, see how it plays out. And you will find that many preconceptions don't have any basis in truth. And to be willing to let the different challenges or confusing circumstances be good triggers to take out these illusions is actually very worthwhile. And then you find that you change. It's not that you go inside and look at your sanskaras and decide which ones to change. It doesn't really work like that. The things that you can't see, you're beginning to be able to see. That is a change. And once you see something you couldn't see before, then a lot of things change because of that clarity. And when you really use these red flags. Like as soon as you think to yourself or say to yourself, if somebody's rejecting me, that means they are wrong. Maybe not. If somebody's refusing me, it means they're hurting me. Maybe not. Look at yourself very closely and see, are you actually suffering? Or, if your ego got cut down and it hurt, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is it a good thing to have some illusions taken out, or you want to keep them? Yeah. If we think on the base of feelings, which is the emotional immaturity way, we won't make any progress. But if we think on the basis of thought, really thinking what's real, what's not real, what's true, intelligent point of view, then we will see, well, yes, it might be hurting my ego, but actually I am not suffering. The real I is not suffering. The real I is perfectly okay. It's getting a lesson, it maybe has to tolerate something, but it itself is actually doing better. So then we would have to say that that thing which hurt the ego is a fortunate thing. Think about those things. Always think of things in new ways, because it gives you new angle, and then you see something you didn't see before. So it's always a good thing. Okay, Om Shanti.